cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. All right, so there we have the final two episodes of the denial of Peter. We kind of concluded our discussion based on this passage and some of the conclusions and thoughts that we had rolling out of this. This sort of ends this episode of Peter's denial, but any lingering thoughts or comments, anything that we notice here? It is a brief section, but anything that stands out to us about this evening at all? As we're kind of concluding. Well, then I'll just keep rolling. When they had led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters, it was early morning. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Well, then take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show by what kind of death he was going to die. All right, so this is a loaded section and episode here with lots of things that we've commented on this, or I've commented on this, and we've made these connections already. But any thoughts here on the first interaction between Jesus? It's actually the interaction between the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders, and Pilate. James, go ahead.
Okay, it says that the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death."
That's right.
That's like a chicken answer, or a chicken statement, because they are allowed to.
Well,
especially for blasphemy.
Not anymore.
Not
if they were in charge of the civil government, then that might be true. But as it turns out, they're no longer in charge of the civil government. So it's not true.
Why did they try to stone that woman, though? Because that would have been unlawful for them to stone the woman that was caught in adultery earlier.
You're probably right about that.
They just pick and choose what they want.
That is a fair assessment, but I think it's also accurate that what they're saying here is that it's not lawful for them to put anyone to death, which isn't inaccurate, right? What they're saying here, again, this is one of these loaded, ironic statements from the Jews, which isn't wrong and not right. It's not lawful for them to put anyone to death, and they're going to keep trying to do it anyway, right?
Still, it sounds like they're just trying to pass the buck.
Well, they are in essence, right? Well, they know that. So their initial response is like the way that a juvenile, like a preteen, would argue about the way that they, if I am so fried after today that I can't even think of an analogy, but like.
Really, that was enough right there.
I wouldn't have done this if it was wrong, would I? Like something ridiculous like that, right? Like we wouldn't have brought him to you if he wasn't guilty, so just do what we want. That's their first way of trying to operate, which is like a completely juvenile answer, right? Because they don't even answer the question. What is Pilate?
Pilate throws it back to them, says, "Do what you go and you judge them by your law."
Initially, Pilate says, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" Right? So this question that Pilate is asking is because it's not uncommon for the Jews to drag criminal elements to Pilate. Now, we have to remember, again, the Pharisees are concerned about the integrity of the people of Israel. What we're going to learn later is that there's another guy, Barabbas, who's in the custody of Pilate. We of course know his name. We don't know how he came into the custody of Pilate, but you could, based on the same sort of way that the Pharisees have treated Jesus, you could see that they would have handed Barabbas over also at some point, because Barabbas was this zealotous, rabble-rousing, apparently, criminal element that was agitating in the city, or at least around the city, and causing disturbances. Maybe the Pharisees were like, let's get this guy arrested too. We don't want the Romans crashing out in Jerusalem. So it wouldn't have been uncommon for Pilate to have these interactions with the religious leaders of the Israelites, because the religious leaders of the Israelites, like you were saying, sometimes they're going to take matters into their own hand and sometimes they're not, right? They are sort of picking and choosing in this regard.
Well, they must have had something against Barabbas for Pilate to take him, because
Well,
Pilate's already taken him into custody.
He is accused of, crimes against the state is sort of the general understanding.
Yeah, that's what it sounded like.
Right,
Yeah,
of his
insurrection or something like that.
Yeah. So, going back to the issue of the Romans probably wouldn't have cared if the Jews stoned women that they considered to be, prostitutes.
Yeah, they didn't
or
have the man out there.
whatever.
Either.
They were like the Jews wouldn't have been. That wouldn't have been as big an issue for the Jews, and it wouldn't have been as big an issue for the Romans. The killing of a woman that's caught in adultery, like the Romans probably wouldn't have made that big of a deal, but the killing of a man was probably in a different category. And he's not just any man. He is a religious leader who has a following, in their minds, a cult following, that they want to at least give some idea of a justifiable execution.
Well, it sounds
Right.
like to me that Pilate turns it back over to them. I mean, because they have said at that time, it's like, hey, you turned him over to us.
Yeah. Well, Pilate is not again, Pilate isn't somebody who is unsmart.
Yeah.
He's a relatively intelligent guy. He would have been an aristocratic Roman. He would have been educated in the logic and philosophy of Rome. So he has some ability to critically think. And his whole thing here is like, well, what accusation do you bring? He's looking for a accusation of criminality against Roman law. Like he's looking for something criminal. And they say, we wouldn't have brought him unless he was guilty.
But I have to have some charges to indict
Well,
him, so what's up here?
Right? Then he goes, well, go take him to your place, right? Go deal with him yourselves. And that's the thing. Then they bring up, they bring up the issue, it's not lawful for us to kill this guy. It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Now, this, again, works on a couple of different levels. Number one, it works because they are no longer in charge of the civil state. That is Rome. Rome is in charge of the civil state. Rome is the one that makes decisions on life and death, not the Jews, not really, civilly. If they're going to try to get this done as righteously as possible, they're going to get Rome to do it so that they are, hands washed out of the picture, which is eventually what ends up happening for them, kind of technically. But they're also the reason why this concludes by saying this was to show by what sort of death he was going to die, which are the concluding statements of this section that the gospel writer John puts in there. That reveals that the second layer to this meaning isn't just that the Jews don't have the authority of the state, but that his death is completely bogus. It is a unjustifiable
Well, the
execution.
Jews would have executed him the same way as what the Romans did, because the Romans did crucifixion.
That's
the
right.
Jews probably would have
Stoned
stoned
him.
him.
Yeah, or thrown him off the temple.
Yeah.
That would have been the other way.
What is it?
Throw him off the temple,
Oh.
right? Which was one of the temptations that we heard about. But anybody that was a blasphemer, which was their primary, that's eventually what they're going to get to, is that he's blaspheming and making himself out to be God. That is their primary accusation, and that's the one that actually throws wrenches into Pilate's thinking and makes him want nothing to do with the whole scenario, like in a couple of verses. But here they're just trying to sort of ramrod this false accusation down Pilate's throat without any witnesses or testimonies or trials. It's the entry point here into this sort of conviction. But
Is this the
Go ahead.
first time Jesus has had any interaction with the Romans, authorities? Did they know who he was before this point?
That's a good question. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus performs a miracle for a centurion who would have been a high-ranking member of Roman military status. And we know that this guy had a home in and around the city. I can't remember what city it was. I think it was Jerusalem, but I'm not 100% sure. We know that in that regard, Jesus had interaction with somebody
Yeah.
in the military echelons. But if he had any interaction with Pilate, that's unclear at this point, because the interaction between Pilate and Jesus is sort of like a fact-finding back and forth. Pilate isn't aware of who Jesus is or what his claims are. Pilate's wife seems to have some sort of supernatural revelation about Jesus to some extent. Exactly how accurate it is unclear, but she has a significant amount of paranoia and disease about interacting with Jesus. So if the question is how much interaction does Pilate have, I would say probably none up until this point. How much interaction do other Romans have? Maybe to some degree some, but as far as the extent of that interaction, it's unclear, right? Other than the centurion whose servant was healed, I don't remember offhand other significant events that Jesus interacts with Roman officials of any high rank or regard. Yeah.
I was going to say, I don't recall that in any of the Gospels, Pilate asked Jesus concerning any miracles. However, Herod, though, when Jesus went to Herod, Herod was looking for a miracle. So Herod knew about Jesus. But
Right.
Pilate never asked him, so I would think that had this news of Jesus gotten to Pilate, and I wouldn't think he would keep himself out of what was going on in there, but I would think that he would ask him about some of these miracles or expected some sort of sign or something.
Maybe.
Perhaps.
I don't know.
I think that'd just be really hard to ignore in that instance. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, the fascination, Herod is fascinated with Jesus because of the cultural, religious
The
kind of
accounts.
totem that Jesus is. Like John the Baptist was like a fascination for Herod. I don't know about Pilate.
Pilate just seems to be really kind of unaware.
Well, yeah, and you know, if you were a Roman aristocrat and a Roman official, you had to be by confession a pagan or a polytheist. Like it was an unquestioned aspect of Roman aristocracy. You had to believe in the pantheon of the gods and sacrifice and worship the gods. That was sort of a unofficially official aspect of the upper class of Rome. But even within that class of people, it was still hit or miss as to their actual devotion and conviction regarding the gods or not, if that makes sense. So it's not unlike a lot of other religious practices where people can, of course, give lip service to the particular religious tradition that they're a part of, but not really be devoted or convicted about its actual underlying tenets or the deities that are a part of that system. Of course, any religion hopes for conviction and piety, but it doesn't always happen to the same degrees for everybody. So it's unclear as to how faithful Pilate is to the Roman pantheon or how attuned he is to spiritual things. His wife, of course, as we will learn, seems to be fairly attuned to spiritual forces, but to what benefit, and what aims and outcomes.
Yeah.
So, anyway, any other thoughts or comments here on this section where Jesus interacts with Pilate? Any other?
What I'd also like to know is the headquarters. Does he live there also, Pilate?
Pilate would, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's kind of almost like a work from home kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I don't know. Pilate would have been there for an amount of time, and he has his domicile within that compound, probably, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, to the extent, I don't know how comfortable or uncomfortable it would be, but most likely it's probably going to be as comfortable as you can make it. If you're the Roman governor of that area, you're probably going to live in a more luxurious setting than most people would in that place. So
it's also where he conducts his business at.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's his headquarters, the command center, the judge and jury. He's it, right? He sits on the seat of authority. He's the one with all power, civil power, and he's going to execute that however he sees fit. That's sort of his fiefdom, right? Jerusalem and Israel have been given to Pilate as a fiefdom, essentially, to run and rule as he saw fit. So, any other thoughts here or comments on the interaction between the initial interaction here, the initial accusations? Go ahead, Ken.
In 32, what's it referring to when it says this took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die?
unlawful at the hands of sinful men. These sorts of predictions Jesus has made throughout the gospel. And so here you have this statement. That's what I was saying, is like, on one level, this is the Jews admitting that on a civil level, they don't have the authority to commit this execution, right? It's outside of their civic boundaries. But what John is saying here is that this actually works on a deeper level, which is that on a spiritual, religious level, the death that Jesus is dying is at the hands of sinful men, or the death that Jesus is dying is an unjustifiable death. The people that are putting him to death don't actually have the authority to put him to death, right? Like, all these things are now coming together that Jesus had been saying up until this point, and this moment sort of calcifies or concentrates this fulfillment of these predictions, these prophetic statements from Jesus across the last 17 chapters, and especially during the statements about his departure that he's made since chapter 13 have all revolved around this sort of episode and event, that he is going to be treated poorly and unjustifiably, at the hands of sinful men. So, any other thoughts or comments or insights? All right, well, then let's keep going. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." And Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" After he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So, do you want me to release for you or to you the king of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. So here we find it was a robber, actually. All right, so this is, again, another very famous, clear episode for us, one we're familiar with. Any thoughts or comments or observations or?
This scene was always kind of confusing because at this point, Jesus really isn't like a prisoner. He's just kind of like in custody, being questioned.
Mm-hmm.
But they're just like, you know what, screw it. We got to execute somebody. Who's it going to be?
That's eventually where it comes to, right?
Yeah. I guess it's like, this might be more towards, like what's like the litigation process in ancient Roman time.
Yep.
In this moment in time, if they really were following any rhyme or reason,
Well, again, the Romans weren't concerned about non-Roman citizens. If you were not a Roman, then they could care less. Like, you were not, you had no right to any sort of jurisprudence at any level, right? So the fact that Pilate is even entertaining this whole escapade of the Jews at his headquarters is, kind of this great, he would see it, I think, as this benevolent act, right? He doesn't have to adjudicate this stuff, right? Like, he doesn't have to give anybody any sort of just due process or anything like that. That burden does not exist. It exists if you're a Roman citizen, and that can be proved and validated from birth records and lineages. Then, like we know this from St. Paul, then you are credited with a significantly rigorous, actually, litigious process, right? Like, you have recourse for appeal to higher authorities, all the way up to the Roman emperor to appeal your case, which is what St. Paul eventually does, right? But for Jesus and the rest of the Jews that are not Roman citizens by birth or by, by military service or anything, Pilate doesn't owe them anything. All right, so that's his. I think when he says here, "Am I a Jew? Like, what do I care about this stuff?" Right? He's like, I don't care about these claims. Your people delivered you over to me.
Following up.
Yeah, it's early in the morning, right? It's early. What? I don't want to deal with this, right? This is sort of Pilate's whole demeanor here. I think. Anyway, any other thoughts or comments on this? This passage has a lot of detail, Go ahead.
Where he goes, we've done. Okay,
Yeah.
My kingdom is not of this. If my kingdom were, my servants would have been fighting that I'm.
Yep.
I don't get quite. What's he arguing there? What's he trying to get him to understand there?
Jesus?
Yeah,
Okay, so...
they'd be fighting, or, I'm like kind of confused what he's trying to say there.
Okay.
And how Pilate would understand what he's trying to say.
So we kind of talked about this a little bit on Sunday. Oh, this is working.
There was another one on the floor over
That's
there.
all right. Got a lot of casualties on this. So, in regards to the church as an entity, there's two aspects to this entity, which is a reflection or a manifestation of the two aspects of the human being. So the human being has the soul and the flesh, or this, you could say spirit and flesh and that sort of thing. It's two aspects, but a singular thing. Does that make sense? So when Jesus here is talking about his kingdom, a lot of times, and this of course can be really tricky for people, a lot of times we move straight to a physical or corporeal reality. What I mean by that is, when Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world, our first thought is, where's his castle? Or something like that. Where's the land? Where's the borders? Where's the turrets? And that sort of a thing. However, this is probably better understood as rule or reign, not a physical entity. Now, the rule or reign of something is less about the corporeal aspect of it and more about the spiritual aspect, right? Rule or reign is over the heart or soul of a thing. So when Jesus here is making the claim that his kingdom is not of this world, what he is saying is, I don't execute ministry or execute authority in the way of earthly rulers, like conversing with you, Pilate. Your authority is over flesh and blood. Your authority is not over spiritual hearts and souls. When Jesus is saying, my kingdom is not of this world, what he's saying is, I don't rule or reign like an earthly king. That's what he's communicating.
Does Pilate get that?
No, that's what he says. So you are king.
I'm like,
Right? So what Pilate is thinking of is this. He is thinking of kingdom in terms of boundaries, earthly politics, armies, challenges to Caesar, etc. Right? That's where Pilate is thinking. King of the Jews, right? This is the warrior king of the Jews, right? But what Jesus is saying is, I don't execute authority. I don't lead and rule and reign like an earthly king. My kingdom isn't like the world. My rule and reign isn't like the rest of the kingdoms of this world.
Well, the Jews, they thought the same thing. They thought that Jesus was going to be a ruler of the physical...
Yeah, they had this major confusion, right? That the Messianic kingdom, or the Christological kingdom, was in the first place a kingdom of reestablishing the kingdom of Israel, right? That is, as a physical, flesh and blood, political entity on earth to become rich governors like Pilate, right? This is a regular question that the disciples and the apostles ask. Oh, at this time, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel?
That's the second coming.
Right. Well, yes, but just because it's the second coming doesn't mean that in the current age, the rule and reign of the kingdom of heaven or the rule and reign of God doesn't come to earth. Because where does the rule and reign of God come? It comes wherever the gospel is preached. It comes wherever faith is believed, wherever the trust of God is bestowed, and these sorts of things. Wherever that is where the rule and reign of God is. That's where God's will and God's righteousness are being executed. Right? So in that regard, when this question is coming up about the kingdom, Pilate is making the same mistake that Nicodemus made earlier, right? Nicodemus comes to Jesus asking these questions that have deep, spiritual, heavenly rule and reign questions. How can a man be born again? Jesus is talking about this from the spiritual heart and soul. And his criticism of Nicodemus is, I can't even explain earthly, I can't even talk to you about earth, flesh and blood things. How am I even going to talk to you about kingdom of heaven things? Right? If we can't, you're the teacher of Israel and you don't understand this, this is Jesus' whole criticism of Nicodemus. And again, this is a regular issue for a significant number of the people that Jesus interacts with initially. Initially, the woman at the well, her statements to Jesus are like, where's your bucket? How are you going to get water? Right? She is only perceiving him as a flesh and blood moron at that point, out in the desert without a bucket. Right? How are you going to get water? Are you just going to sit here and wish the water up? That's kind of her whole take on Jesus initially. Then she realizes, or I shouldn't say she does, but by the revelation of the Holy Spirit, she comes to the conviction that he is a spiritual messianic figure, not just here for flesh and blood reasons, but here for spiritual, heavenly, divine reasons. And that's where her heart flips, right? That's where conversion happens. And the same thing is happening with Pilate, right? Jesus is preaching to Pilate, my kingdom isn't of this world. And Pilate is, oh, so you're a king. That's all I needed to know. Thanks. Right? That's really how that goes.
And when he says that if I were, they'd be fighting for me, not to the Jews.
Yep.
Y'all would be wanting to take care of this.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that correct?
Am I
reading that right?
Jesus has already had this out with Peter in previous episodes, right? Peter wants to draw the sword and start hacking away at people, and Jesus goes, this is not the way, right? That's Jesus' statement, and it's actually even stronger than it is, I think, on a spiritual component, because Jesus says, are you trying to upheave the will of God? That's what Jesus' statement to Peter is. Am I not supposed to drink the cup that my Father has poured for me? That's what Jesus says to Peter, right? You're going to try to get in the way of the will of God here?
You told him to get behind me.
Yeah, bad idea.
Yeah.
Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup my Father has given me to drink? Right? Oh, go ahead, Casey.
So this might be a tangent that you
That's
don't
okay.
go down. Sometimes people use this to justify pacifism.
Yep.
Would that
What
is
was
it
it to justify what?
pacifism?
Oh,
Pacifism.
Would this be appropriate? Or is I've not ever been able to come down concretely on what I think about pacifism versus protection and those types of things.
So I think pacifism is a completely legitimate conclusion that a Christian could come to. But I do not think that it is a command for all Christians to adhere to. Does that make sense?
Yes, could you say why you don't think it's a command?
Well,
I'm challenging it, I'm just curious about the reasoning.
yeah, well, there is no command from Jesus to interact with the civil authority in a pacifistic way. What his statement here is that my rule and reign are not of this world. If anything, this is a statement that Christians should not take up the sword in the pursuit of the expansion of the kingdom. The question of civil authority, who was in charge of Jerusalem, right? Whatever. We don't have to rehash the Crusades. But the point would be, like, if the state of Iowa declares itself to be a Christian theocracy, bad idea, and then says all Christian men of military age are going to be given AR-15s to go and fight against the radical commies in Minnesota to take over southern Minnesota for the expansion of this Christian, principality of Iowa, I would say, all right, time out, right? This is not the job of Christians. Christians are not supposed to take up the sword and go to people and say, become a Christian or we're going to cut your head off, right? That is not the methodology of evangelism. This is also gives us an obvious critique of things like the Islamic revolutions that take place, that it is either death or tax for the sake of Islam and the expanse of the religion and the Islamophobe, or not Islamophobe, but the Islam of caliphate, that's what I'm trying to say, of Islam, right? Now, that is, of course, an aberrant pagan project, Islam's expansion. And here, Christ's statement about, if my kingdom were of this world, or were of this world, my soldiers would be fighting, but my kingdom is not of this world, right, is to say, if you are a Christian, your primary vocation isn't to extend the kingdom of God through the use of violence in the civil realm. That is not a legitimate use. Now, I can see, right, that as a Christian, if your conviction is that you should, and Jesus, I think, comes to this in this passage, which is like, you can be drawn to the conclusion that Christians should not fight in any armed conflict. That, I think, is a rational and logical conclusion that you can come to, not only based on this passage, but other subsequent statements from Jesus and the apostles about, especially St. Paul, about the fruits of the Spirit for peaceableness, etc. Right? However, that also doesn't delegitimize the civil authority's necessity for war making at times, because there are significant other passages in Scripture that identify that the civil authority is established by God for the protection and good of the citizenry, and at times the sword must be bared for the protection of that citizenry against unlawful overage, right? Those are also clear statements both from the New Testament and from the Old. So in that, it could be that one Christian would be convicted that it's his role to be a pacifist, or her role to be a pacifist and not take up arms, which is legitimate. Not everybody is actually qualified. Not everybody has that ability or spirit. I wrote a giant paper in my first couple of years here about how the way that the United States military actually goes about training soldiers is illegitimate for Christians. We shouldn't just be pushing young men into the military training and teaching them how to kill. We should be trying to identify professional soldiers, and we should be making them the best soldiers possible, like knights used to be. And then they should be the generals that lead the other armies if it is needed. So I am convicted against a large standing army that's constantly trained to kill, because as we're finding out now, that's not good for the spiritual well-being of most people. Now, some men can bear that. Some men can be trained to kill and trained to do all the things of soldiery, and it actually doesn't break them to pieces. But a lot of men can't do that, right? A lot of men can't bear that office. And that's just the way it is, right? Some men couldn't imagine killing and would never want to be involved in that, and they shouldn't. And especially if their conviction is that they're supposed to be peaceable and pacifistic, I'm not going to argue with that. I think that's legitimate. But at the same time, if you're a Christian man and you're like, no, I could totally kill in the service to the nation if Caesar asked me to do that, then that would be just as valid a vocational position as a Christian as a pacifist. So it works both ways. Anyway, that's a long.
So follow your heart with careful consideration.
Yeah, well, and if you have it's morbid, but if you have the stomach and the constitution to kill, which not everybody does,
I
right?
think it's like basic underlying principles. Which one are most important to you? Like defending peace and harmony of your neighbor, or maintaining this idea of not harming anyone. So it's like competing values, and some people hold those values more highly than others.
Yeah, it is definitely. I would say it's, again, as morbid as it sounds. It's the various gifts that have been given to men and women to a certain extent, but especially to men on earth. Like some men are peaceable and agreeable and want to promulgate harmony at the cost of letting some people live that maybe other men would go, we should kill those people. And there's justifiable reason to kill those people. And can both of those people exist in a Christian ethos? The answer is yes. Right? That's exactly right. That is a legitimate argument. Should we be war making or should we be peaceable? Those are legitimate arguments, to have as Christians, because that actually keeps our discourse honest. Because if it's all one side, things go wrong, and if it's all the other side, things go wrong. You want to have competing voices and claims to what's beneficial for the population now. But the difficulty with this is that all these conversations have to happen in time. And because they have to happen in time, they're always subject to renegotiation and change. Because the one thing about time is that it always changes things. And we're always in a new set of circumstances. And things are always being called out of us or called from us by God because of the certain circumstance. And we might have to respond differently at one time than we do at another time. So that's the difficulty of that whole thing. But anyway, does that get at it a little bit? There's not a standardized dogmatic answer is what I'm trying to say about pacifism, nor should there be.
Has it ever been in the history of the church?
No. Well, the Quakers, right? The Anabaptists and the Quakers make it a standard sort of dogmatic answer, but they're the only ones, and those poor guys got killed a lot by the Roman Catholics and the Lutherans back in the day. So that was the only thing that the Catholics and the Lutherans could agree on at one point was, are you going to kill those Anabaptists or are we going to kill them? That was what they had.
For them during wartime really sucked.
Yeah. Well, a lot of them, Casey and I took our honeymoon down to Belize, and we ran into a bunch of like white-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Amish that were running around in the tropical rainforest of Belize, and we were like, what the heck is going on here? And I had a chit-chat with one of them, and they were like, oh, our ancestors came down here, in Vietnam, because they didn't want to get drafted. And they just cart and buggied it across the Mexico border, right down to Central America. So some people.
I mean, my grandparents talked about how hard it was. Men in Amana.
Oh yeah, right.
During war.
Oh yeah, that makes sense.
It was a hard time for them.
Yeah, right. Yep.
Because it was such a conflict of.
Yeah. Well, they were probably seen as traitors for not fighting.
Well, they were spied upon.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
For being close enough.
Yep. Sympathetic to the German cause. I know. Yeah.
Wasn't pretty.
No. All right. Any other, again, big passage here with these interactions between now Jesus and Pilate? Any other aspects of this passage that stand out to us or pique our interest or lead us to confusion or need for clarification or anything?
Maybe this is like a rabbit hole, which you know how I am about this, but this question of kingdom and it being not of this world, but yet still within the world, kind of. Mm-hmm. Does that have anything to kind of play with the idea of the millennia in relation to the end times? Because there's talk about a millennial rule of Jesus, of Christ, or whatever on earth.
Yeah, well, what it reveals is that the premillennial and postmillennial positions are bogus. Because what is being revealed in this statement is that Jesus is at work ruling and reigning at this moment. When Pilate asks him this question, his expression here is that my rule and reign isn't of this world. And the legitimate question is, well, how is it that you've been ruling and reigning? Right?
Yeah.
What should I have seen? What should I look for? Now, this is a question that in other Gospels, John the Baptist asks, right? John the Baptist is expecting the rule and reign of Jesus to look like fire, the hellfire of judgment and brimstone, right? That's what he's looking for. And what does Jesus come doing? He comes healing, driving out demons, raising the dead, and preaching the gospel, right? Preaching that the kingdom of God has come. And that's what he says. You go tell John, this is what the rule and reign looks like. And so, again, in that statement, what Jesus is identifying is that in his person, right, in his ministry and mission, the rule and reign of the kingdom of God is actually happening. Now, it has, on the ground, flesh and blood consequences, but those flesh and blood consequences, as he says here, aren't, we got to take up the sword for the expansion of this kingdom. We'll slash people's throats until they believe, right? No. What does Jesus then employ? What do his deputies then go out and do? They go out and preach the gospel and administer the sacraments and teach everything that Jesus has commanded. In the first place, that's a matter of the heart and the soul, right? Because where the heart is, there everything goes, right? Whatever you treasure in your heart is what your treasure is. That's what it is. Another way to say this, or a more Lutheranized way to say this, is there's a distinction between the law and the gospel. There's a major distinction there. And that distinction must be maintained at all costs. And if there's any confusion between that distinction, everything goes bad. If you mix the gospel with the law or the law with the gospel, each thing fails to be what it's distinctly supposed to be. So, for example, if I wanted to be a Mormon, I would say things like, well, this Sunday, I'm going to examine all the giving reports, and if any of you are under 10% of a tithe, then you can get the hell out of here. Because that's a principle of the Mormon Church, that it is a mandatory 10% tithe for admission and adherence into the kingdom, right? Or at least, in their case, the temple, to qualify for the temple. Now, that's a confusion of the law for the gospel. That is to say, if we bash you over the head with a tithe, that's going to make you holier. Kids, I don't know. Just came over with a mouthful of stuff. So anyway, what? Of course. But we'll deal with offerings here because it's a very good topic. I don't know what any of you give. In fact, you're the only you know what I give, right? You know what I'm supposed to give because you know what my salary is, and if you don't know, it's posted. So you know what my offering should be, and you could go to the finance committee and you could be like, "Hey, what's Pastor Belt's giving?" And they'd probably tell you.
I'm looking forward to you giving us the pulled pork.
Oh yeah, pulled pork on Wednesday. Yeah. But
I'll tell you right now.
yeah, the issue with giving is If I make it a law, if I stood up in the pulpit and I was like, you got to give 10%, and if you don't give 10%, you're not a real Christian. This place would clear out like that. Would clear out quick. Because whether or not you know it, I mean, that's a confusion of the point and purpose of this location. Now, what am I hoping? My hope is that the gospel becomes so big and rich in your heart and soul that giving an offering to the church becomes like, I don't know why I wouldn't do this. I love what's going on here. I love coming to church on Sunday and hearing the gospel. I love receiving the Lord's Supper. I love the coffee downstairs. I love the pulled pork on Wednesdays. I want to make sure the lights stay on. I want to make sure that we can change the toilet when we need to, and that we can put new paint up here and there, and maybe pay the pastor too. That would be good. I think that's actually really a great idea. Now that's because of the conviction that God has been very good to you. He's provided you tremendously in your daily life, that out of this love and generosity that he's given to you, it seems only fitting that you would sacrifice out of love and thanksgiving for all that he has given to you back to the very place that he institutionalizes his means of grace and activities of favor. That's what the church is. That's what it's meant to be. But if the church just becomes a social club and we don't like the president anymore, well, I'm not giving an offering. I don't like that. No, this is a confusion of the law and the gospel. Again, this gets back to what's Pilate's issue? Pilate's issue is that he's confused. He's confused about the nature of the ministry and person of Jesus. He thinks that Jesus has come to supplant Rome, or at least that's the claim that the Israelites are making about Jesus. That he has come to establish a kingdom and set himself up like a new David, okay? A new political figure to take over Rome. That's the claim that Israel makes, and that's the fear that Pilate has, or the questioning that Pilate leads to, right?
Pilate doesn't even buy it, though.
Well, Pilate's not concerned about it, right? Oh, you're a king. Great. That's all I needed to know, right? The next question is a spiritual question about truth, right? And this culminates with Pilate, and I think it probably needs to be read a little bit more sarcastically, which is, oh, okay, Jewish Galilean guy, why don't you tell me what the truth is, right? That's how I think Pilate means that, right? Because Jesus is at this point, beaten up, dirty Hebrew wannabe teacher, with a kingdom that's not of this world. All right, crazy guy. And that's why Pilate then comes out and goes, I don't find any guilt in this guy. He's like, yeah, this guy's.
Well, like I said, he doesn't buy it.
He's a harmless idiot. That's essentially what is going. That's essentially what Pilate's claim is, right? This guy's a harmless idiot. So do you want me to release him to you, this harmless idiot, and this guy that thinks he's ruling this imaginary kingdom not of this world and knows what truth is? This guy, or do you want me to release Barabbas, who's the robber, right? And they choose Barabbas, right? So now, again, this is Israel's concrete rejection of Jesus. So this should, and this happens a few times in this whole episode. So we should be reminded of the introductory matters to the Gospel of John, where it's said, where the Gospel writer John says that the Word of God was made flesh and dwelt among us, and then it says, he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. All right? So a significant amount of the ministry of Jesus, and especially these concluding episodes of the Passion, are the fulfillment of those words too, even though that doesn't really, that's not stated as clearly, right? But that he came to his own and his own did not receive him is an after-the-fact observation that the gospel writer puts in the prologue, right? And here you have it. They would rather have Barabbas, an actual criminal that was charged lawfully and under the prosecution of Rome. We would rather have Barabbas than Jesus. All right? right? All right. Any other thoughts here? A lot of different detail, but any other aspects of this that pop out to us, or thoughts or comments or questions or observations here? Let's look at this first part. So, are you the king of the Jews? Pilate says. And Jesus, his first question is a clarifying question, right? Is, have you come to this on your own, or did somebody tell you this? Right? Jesus is looking for clarification. And that leads Pilate.
Fair question.
Right, it's a fair question. And then Pilate, I think Jesus is wondering if he's actually interested, right? What's your motivation here behind asking this question?
Actually, doesn't that answer, am I a Jew, which
Yeah.
is a question, he doesn't sound like he's very interested.
No, he's not. He could. That's it.
He could
Pilate
care
could
less.
care less. He is. It's early in the morning. He has to deal with these Jewish people. He's looking for a quiet weekend, right? He wants to go golfing. It's nice. It's the desert in the fall, right? It's warm in the afternoons and cool in the mornings. He wants to go fishing.
I like in the footnote it says here, Pilate displays irritation for being drawn into what he perceived as a Jewish squabble.
Yeah, that's right.
He's motivated by jealousy of Jesus' public ministry.
I know.
I like the way they phrase that.
Yeah. Mom, Silas is hitting me again. Figure it out. Right? That's essentially what Pilate's demeanor is here. Right? Just, do I need to be involved in this? Right? Am I a Jew? Can we quit it with all this idiocy? Right? This is sort of Pilate's whole demeanor right now. Okay? I don't want to get wrapped up in this. This guy's crazy. He's a part of a delusional, fictitious kingdom. He's arguing with a Roman about truth. I backload this with Pilate is the pedigree of coming from Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. And again, as an aristocratic Roman, he would have had exposure to this in what would have been the education that he would have received. If you want to get into a philosophical argument about truth with a Roman, especially a high-functioning Roman, what Pilate's demeanor here is you better pack a lunch, right? What is, why don't you tell me what truth is? Go ahead, right? And so this whole initial episode is of annoyance. This is petty. We talked about this beforehand, but this positioning for Pilate is low class office, low position, right? There's a couple of different theories about Pilate and this person. Either he's a young guy trying to climb up a ladder, or he's an old guy that got thrown down the ladder.
He's just
right?
waiting out his time.
Right. And he is just mad, spitting nails that he got caught or demoted or whatever because of whatever reason we don't really know, right? I think more people tend towards the latter, which is that he was this older guy that got demoted and thrown into Judea, which is this crap posting for the end of his career, right? And that would make me mad. And he has to deal with this, right? That would suck, right? If you're being empathetic to Pilate, being in a position where you've maybe ascended to a certain level and then for some arbitrary military or political squabble, you said the wrong thing at the wrong time, and now you're in Judea,
It's not back.
You're not I don't know if any, my only, there's the new Jack Ryan episodes that Prime Video put out where John Krasinski plays Jack Ryan. And I think they're really well done, the first 2 seasons anyway. And in the first season, you learn, and it's the black guy that plays, can't remember the name of the character now, but he was posted in the Soviet Union or posted in the Moscow CIA consulate or the American consulate, and he was the CIA director of that consulate. And he gets busted back to Langley to work over the financial department, of cybercrime or whatever at Langley. And everybody's he was in Moscow and now he's here. He must have done something really bad, he must have really. And it was he threw some guy out of a window, right? This, I can't remember the whole episode. Anyway, but it's that. Pilate's that guy. He was at a premier posting most likely, or a much more premier posting, said something wrong, made the wrong politician mad, beat the wrong guy at a game of chess. I don't know. And now he's in Judea,
So,
and he has to deal with this.
so we're talking
people.
about a place that basically, if it wasn't like for the Jewish people going back there and the Christian people going there, they wouldn't have any tourism industry.
Yeah, there wouldn't be anything going on. Yeah, it would only be maybe commerce, maybe some commercial travel, because that would have been a trade route that wouldn't have gone across the Mediterranean. And we know that Rome had significant land holdings across the north of Africa, and were descending down the Nile Valley to try to extend the kingdom of the Romans, or the empire of the Romans, with little success. But anyway, all right. Any other thoughts or comments here, or questions? As we're kind of at the end of our time, but any other points of interest or anything? All right, well then let's depart with the benediction of the Lord. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and